I had been interested in East Asian history as an undergraduate, and I thought, well, Korea's kind of close to China, same, it's up there in Northeast Asia somewhere. I never looked back after that. Was just one thing led to another, and I ended up teaching about Korea over the last 36 years. So I started teaching at the University of Washington for a few years, and then Southern California, and then Indiana University for the last 20 years. And I just finished this year. I just decided not to go back. I'd jump off the cliff and try to start a new life as a much poorer retired person. But I think it was that what I was doing at Indiana was no longer really, I think I'd done what I needed to do at the university. But I've been talking to teachers for all these years, and it is this kind of format and this kind of a session that excites me. I guess I'm sort of burned out in the classroom in some ways with teaching international students about themselves. You end up with Korean students, Chinese students, and others in large proportions in survey courses at IU now because of their drive to bring in students to drive tuition, really. And I'm going to let my junior colleagues do that for a while, and I'm going to work on working with youth, which is a lot more fun. My training was up here at the University of Washington, so I spent the decade of the 1970s in the Northwest, and this is always a homecoming every time I come back. And I have to say the contrast of Portland 40 years ago and now is just, they were making good decisions 40 years ago about what to do in this city. It's just spectacular. I spent a beautiful afternoon yesterday walking around downtown, and that was a joy for me. It was really wonderful. What I'd like to do is to not give you any kind of a narrative of 5,000 years of Korean history, but to drop into various portions of the historical experience of the record and try to draw from that the larger themes that I teach using these parts of Korean history. I've been mostly teaching contemporary and modern Korea, which is the 19th century and 20th century. But in order to do that, we always have to do some backfill, particularly with the earlier periods. And what I want to come up with is ideas of things to teach using Korean material, in effect. What are the ideas, what are the things I think students ought to know coming out of any history course? And that usually is, what are the larger structures around their lives that have antecedents, that are very strong and powerful and that affect their lives without them knowing it. Meaning institutions, meaning systems and other historically evolved structures that the students are not aware of until they take a history course and take one that can start to look at what's behind the decisions they're trying to make as they strategize through life. They really, in many ways, don't want to know about this because often it impinges on their idea of their little straight track. I did not have a straight track through life. We had wars, we had places where we couldn't make decisions about what we were going to do. And that profoundly affected me early in my intellectual life. The idea that the structural ideology of the Cold War could interrupt my life for 5 years. I'm still thinking about that once in a while, and the fact that the students we're teaching now aren't even aware of the fact that we all grew up in a bipolar world structured in a certain way after World War II that led to decisions our governments were making that affected our lives, greatly. And so that's kind of the meta reasoning behind a lot of my teaching, and I can use Korea just as well as any other place to get at that kind of a discussion with my students. I always start out, and geography is everything, And Korea is only a creature, of its physical structures as well. And I like to talk about the peninsular nature of this society, the land and the climate. I use to teach about rice agriculture, basically. And one of the most important things to understand about East Asia in particular is, the size of the populations, the density, and land use are all based on a very long sort of evolution of rice agriculture. And that the Koreans themselves, from south to north have a very different experience with regard to how they feed themselves. In the south, we talk about more rain, less rain up north, the Asian monsoon, all of these sorts of things I start out with that are really talking in a larger sense about the way in which East Asia articulates with its Pacific hinterland. And also I use this early one class to talk about origins of people and to make a distinction in East Asia between different populations. The Koreans are not Chinese, and that seems silly, but to our students it isn't at all. They kind of think, same thing. We've got a lot of Asian people over there that look alike. But the Koreans are from a completely different group originally, and if we use the archaeological record, we see that they're not related to the Chinese at all, other than that they have 2,000 years of very close neighborly cultural relations. But as a people, they come out of Central Asia. And the linguistics is very interesting because they often think of Chinese language as being this kind of predominant language group, the Sino-Tibetan group that must dominate all of that area. And yet Korea is no more related to Chinese than it is to English. It's an Altaic, Tungusic language. It is related to Japanese, Manchu, Mongolian, various Siberian dialects that go way over China and back in toward the Altai region of Central Asia. And the students are looking at that and they're, well, what about these characters? Well, it's an introduction to then language as a vernacular and language as a written form of communication. And this comes up again throughout a course on Korea. The Koreans, very interestingly, kept speaking Korean because it was easy for them, not for us. But they used Chinese as their written language all the way up into the 20th century or into the late 19th century. So they used a form of classical Chinese as a formal means of communication of elites. And when we get rolling in modern Korea, pretty soon that language issue becomes a very important issue of identity and of the origins of Korean nationalism, and the discussions around why are we using a foreign language for our written communication at the elite formal level of society, and we pretend that we are a nation like others in the world. This is a very primal discussion at the beginning of the 20th century for the Koreans, and it raises for me a kind of interesting problem for my Korean students. I have always a number of Korean, either heritage students, adopted students, or international students who are convinced that Korea is 5,000 years old. And what I'm trying to tell them is, no, in terms of a modern identity, in terms of thinking of themselves as a nation in the nation-state system of the world, which is very young, Korea has only really been working at this for about 100 years. Yes, culturally, you can find your roots and you can push them quite a ways back in the historical record and into prehistory and in mythology to your nice 5 millennia. They have in their mind 5,000 years, and this is always in the books. Korea is 5,000 years old. Well, Korea, as we think of it, who knows what was going on 5,000 years ago? But if you want to push your sense of yourselves and create a lineage for yourself, yes, you can take that identity and project it backward, however falsely. They're all, no, that's wrong, it's wrong, you know. We've been Korean forever. Well, maybe. But again, my principal academic interests have always been national identity formation, nationalist ideology. These kinds of ideas are important to my writing. And so I always like to use Korea's rather interesting road toward now a bifurcated identity into a northern and southern nation state as a means to destabilize the students' comfort zones, however I can. I mean, most of our job is subversive. I mean, we're trying to get the kids to not be comfortable and to try to, you know, jog all of this stuff that they bring to us on the basis of, you know, mostly profound ignorance. Well, I mean, isn't that education? I mean, the idea is I was ignorant too, you know, until I engaged the subject and slowly moved my way along, and I'm still ignorant in many ways, but not as ignorant as I was before, and so I think of myself as an educated person. So this elides into the second point about antiquity, and this idea of asking the question of, you know, how old is Korea? And then we can jump from the archaeological record, the linguistic record, the you know, the gene pool, the DNA, everything you want to think about that constitutes this population, a relatively closed population throughout its history on the peninsula, and the modern day and the way in which we construct political identities and cultural identities later. As much as I teach history, we are always trying to talk about the newspapers, or what's going on today. And lucky for us, or for somebody teaching about Korea, Korea's in the news just about every day. Something's going on. Some poor soldier's legs were blown off yesterday, or last week on the DMZ. There's always something that comes up that allows me to bring them back into the present and keep counterposing the past with it. So this historical genesis of the idea of Korea is also inextricably linked to the bifurcation of the country. And I introduced this very early in Korea courses. The students that I'm talking to are from South Korea. They have they have had the master narrative of South Korean historical evolution and of their idea of Korea's historical evolution pounded into their head in grade school, junior high, and high school, sometimes a bit in college. Just as I was raised as an American kid on the 1950s version of the United States and what that was. Now, they don't have the perspective I do of looking back 60 years into the 1950s and trying to remember about steel ingots and many people forged into one American identity and all of the kind of American exceptionalism that was being taught in the way it was taught in the schools in the 1950s and early 60s. They have just what they were told. And so what I try to do early on is to say, you know, these ideas of who we are and the uses of history in order to create those ideas is something very separate from, say, professional history that people do. So there are historians that go and look at traces and write narratives and really work with sources and try to come up with relative truths about how things became the way they are. And then there are the narratives that are deployed by governments and by educational systems and textbooks that are deployed for very different reasons, using many of the same facts, but highly selectively, in order to create and shape a general sense of a common story that we can all share. And I bring this up because I want the American children and the American kids to also understand that I'm not just dealing with say, South Korean students who are raising their hand and objecting to things that I'm talking about and saying, look, we're all every country does this, every nation state does this, is that they evolve a common story for very peculiar reasons. Yes?
I have a great example of that.
Yeah.
I just went to Disney World, and I went to the American history thing.
There you go.
And even my husband, who's like, he knows very little history, and he's a techie. He was embarrassed. I mean, seriously, that was embarrassing. We wrote to them about it. I mean, we were like, get a professional history. None of us, even at the community college level, would teach this stuff. So anyway.
But that is what.
But that's fresh in my mind.
That students are walking through this as young, impressionable kids, and this stuff sticks.
Yeah.
And it's very important. And you know, in some societies, there are more narratives to pick from and more conflict amongst narratives in order to create a kind of relative idea of who, you know, a truth. There are other places like South Korea that have a much more authoritarian approach to a single line. And it's desperately serious stuff in South Korea because they have an alternative vision of the people right north of them, 40 miles. And the North Koreans have a very strictly centered idea of how Korea ought to be thought about as well. And this is part of the problem on the Korean Peninsula. That the longer this goes on, the more this divergence goes on, the more serious it will be to try to bring all these people back together, even though they all talk about their common heritage and their 5,000 years and their blood links and their familial lineage being Koreans. In a sense, this political process of differentiation is now 60, 70 years old, and it continues. We don't know why it continues. It just shouldn't be continuing, but it is. It doesn't make any sense right now, given the relative power and political, the relative power of both places. So we'll get to that at the end when we're talking about division and reunification and those sorts of issues, which impact on current affairs.
I also
very
read
much
an
so,
article just the other day in the paper about that very thing, that the South Korea is saying we must all have the same story. I just read an article about that.
Now, I used to think, when I wasn't a very ambitious young man at all, and just knew that, gee, it would be really neat to be working at the university, and if I could just be a professor like the professors I admired and loved as an undergraduate, I could get a job and sit down and have coffee and talk with interesting people, and that would be my life. Well, I didn't know that that wasn't going to be my life at all. But the fact of the matter is that, history is seriously politicized stuff almost everywhere you go. And you can get into very serious arguments in the United States, but in Korea you can get ostracized and thrown out of the country for looking at the wrong things. And when I was a graduate student, I got in trouble. And I was writing about the wrong people. And when I went to the reference books, I would be reading in the newspapers of the 1920s, and I would be reading all this interesting stuff by these journalists who were clearly very well known and with large voices in the journalism of the mid-20s. And I go to the biographical dictionaries, and they wouldn't be there. They would just be absent. None of them. Well, they were all leftists. They were all socialists. And then you start to see how the record gets washed. And that's why I would be given lectures as a young man. I'd be going to the university to sit at the desk of a famous Korean historian, and he would just get up and he would give me a tongue lashing for an hour. You were not supposed to study. This guy's our collaborator. This guy's a vicious traitor. Yeah, but did you ever read what he was writing in the plans? He was a vicious traitor and a collaborator and a blah, blah. Okay. Well, then I just stopped asking. Because the more they did that to me, the more I wanted to read about this guy. Because he was absent. Yeah.
Can I ask, maybe you're going to get to this, but what is for America's involvement in Korea over these many decades, what is our place in that story? In that common story?
I'm going to get to that.
Oh, okay.
Yeah. Our place, really comes very late. It appears in the late 19th century, and in many ways, by the early 20th century, we've made a blood pact, in a sense, with the Japanese to ignore what they're doing. Our interest in Korea's trade and the missions, Christian missions. And then only in the post-World War II period do we come into Korea with both feet and suddenly become huge and now a never-ending part of the problem. And we're still there with troops and everything else. I'll get to that with the separation. So this idea of, I wanted to go on to the third part here, or we'll never get anywhere. The idea of Korea's longevity and stability is also an important counter-trope in many ways to the way Koreans think of themselves. The last of the great Korean traditional political social systems, the Chosun period from 1392 to 1910, often known as the Yi dynasty as well. This was a system that lasted for over 500 years. And up until about 15 years ago was something that modern Koreans really didn't have much respect for. Partly because it was this system that fell and was unable to maintain Korean sovereignty and independence in the early 20th century in the face of Japanese imperial aggression. And so the subsequent period from 1910 to 1945, the period of Japanese rule, the colonial period, has colored the way in which the Koreans have looked at their own tradition very heavily. And that's because of the nationalist lens they use. Any system that was so corrupt, so senile, so effeminate as to not be able to defend ourselves against the Japanese, well, then we can't really loop them into our story very easily, can we? So in the 1950s and 60s and even the early 70s, Korean nationalist historiography had a very poor opinion of the Yi dynasty. That is, its political weakness at its end, in its 6th century, a system created in the late 14th century projects itself all the way into the 20th century, and they're bad-mouthing it. Well, the other way, they flip that around and you say, my God, what a system. How many political systems do you know that lasted half a millennia? Well, a few Middle Egyptian dynasties. Not even a Chinese system lasts this long. And the reason for that longevity had to do with the way in which this social and political system was very, very delicately balanced and forged from previous systems. So there had been a sort of gradual accumulation, a kind of settlement that comes together in the late 1300s that forges a system that inserts itself into the East Asian political milieu, settles its relationship with this powerful neighbor, China, ignores the Japanese for the most part, and is able to maintain itself for the very long period of time that it does. And it is this moment, it is this 5 centuries that forges what we see in Korea today. This is where all the dialectical differences, the cultural differences, many perhaps religious differences are now smoothed over and gradually homogenized into this very intricately well-balanced and very stable society. That's good if longevity is the goal. Yes, ma'am.
So was it peaceful? Was it?
Well, for the most part, yes. They ended up with no army. I mean, I find this thrilling, and I tell the students that. here is a place that manages to do this and ends up going into the high imperial period, a highly militarized period of global history, with really a civilian government and with no military establishment to speak of. How did it do this? How did it live between, these two much larger societies, China and Japan, and not maintain any kind of large military force? And it did so with a Confucian sort of orthodoxy that valued civil government over military, that if it needed the military, and it did at times, it would raise militia. So the idea was that you only raised armies when you needed to. Otherwise, get the peasants back in the fields, doing what peasants should be doing and producing the substance of the economy, rice. In the middle of the dynasty in the 1590s, it was invaded twice by Hideyoshi from Japan. And these were catastrophic invasions that were inconclusive for the Japanese, but were a terrible experience for the Koreans, with the Ming armies and the Japanese armies all in the peninsula, laying waste to everything. Ultimately, everyone withdraws, and it takes the dynasty almost another century to recover to its productivity and population size previous to that period. That is the one real threat to the dynasty. Yeah.
Can we discuss a question about that administration? How much, prior to Hideyoshi's invasions, how much was that civilian government directly patterned on China? How much might have been adaptations for Korea's unique society? Was it just modeling, or was it doing something else?
Well, thank you for 3B.
Oh, sorry.
You're very, very, very welcome for that segue. I mean, what's going on here is a wonderful synthesis of the best Chinese ideas about civil administration. So, in a sense, the structures of the Chosun court and politics are the same box charts as the Ming dynasty. So they are really looking at the Ming, and the Ming and the Yi dynasty rise at the same time. So this is at the end of the Mongol period in China, and the Koryo, the previous dynasty, the Koryo dynasty, was falling around the same time. And so the new system in Korea emerges as the Ming are coming to ascendance on the mainland of China, in northern China. And it really is one of the geniuses of the founder of Isongye, the Taejo, the great progenitor, the great founder of the dynasty, looks to China and says, we will pay attention to the Ming, we will regulate our relationship with them on a very, very harmonious basis. We will accept investiture from the Chinese emperor of our new kingship here. We will ask the Chinese for a name for our kingdom. We will send tributaries as necessary as possible, as many times as it's necessary. I have tons of officials I can go order and slither in front of the Chinese emperor and give them all the face they want. And it's this realpolitik. Now they're accepting ritual subordination in a multi-state system here in Northeast Asia. And I make a big deal of this because later in the 20th century, the idea of ritual subordination to any other country is an anathema to modern nationalism. So the theory of Belgians ambassador in the United States is if he's the longest tenured ambassador, he becomes first in protocol. Well, Belgium is a no-count country. It has no power. But in theory, all these nation states are equal in their sovereignty and in their ritual relationships. We all know that power is what really counts. But in the East Asian system of the time, when the Yi dynasty was formed, the Chinese had this conceit that, they're the center of the nation, of the world. Everything revolves around them. Peoples civilization is marked in their accordance of how much they accept Chinese norms. And the Koreans were very clever, and they figured this out. And they also, in their own self-belief, that they were much better than the Bueno, the dwarf hairy bandits over the ocean horizon out there, those Japanese barbarians. And, you know, the Ryukyu people, you know, these people, you know, they're below us. So they accept themselves at a secondary position in this kind of fictive Chinese hierarchy. That Chinese tributary system never worked for any length of time. It was a construct in the brain. But the Koreans, for the Chinese sake, played this game, and it kept the Chinese out of China for the balance of the Joseon period. The idea that Korea was a vassal of China is a bunch of bokum. It's just, it's ritual. It had nothing to do with the Chinese having ministers in China or directing Korean affairs. Only in the late 19th century did the Chinese start to meddle in Korean politics.
Although during the invasions by Hideyoshi, they did
Well,
call for China and it's like, well, you're our guys, so
They
you
went
must
to China
help
and
us.
said, save us. I mean, you know, we are your tributary, and, you know, our relationship is such. The Chinese, of course, came in not to save Korea, but to keep the armies from making it to China, rather fight the war, you know, on the peninsula. And again, but when you read the accounts, then this is all done in this kind of ritual language. And so you can set up later Korean sort of arrival and being pulled kicking and screaming into the nation state modern world system in the late 19th century, with how they have been so successfully conducting their international affairs up until that point. Then the relationships with Japan were conducted on the basis of kyorin, or neighborly relations of equals, even though the Japanese were deluded in using the term emperor for their leader. They had an emperor and a shogun. The Koreans thought, you know, well, that doesn't mean anything. There's only one emperor. The emperor lives in Beijing. We are kings and somehow less than. And the blending part that you talked about. So we have this civil administration that has councils and, you know, a monarch and functional ministries underneath it, provincial divisions and sub-provincial divisions down to the county level. That's all taken from the best of the Chinese ideas about civil administration. They also adopted a civil service exam, just like the Chinese. And those exams were based on a Neo-Confucian curriculum. And they were used to pick officials and men of talent to staff the bureaucracy. The blending comes in, who gets to take the exam? Well, aristocrats get to take the exam. So the idea of a very long-grained idea of hereditary privilege and hierarchy in Korean society is wedded to a meritocracy, wedded to a formal meritocracy, so that the exams are then only for the highborn, and it is a function of the exams to basically determine which of the highborn are going to be the highest born, who have positions in the civil service. Then there is a lesser sort of nobility and a kind of a stratum of lesser, the sort of the middle groups of the Chungin and the Hyangni and these public functionaries that are hereditarily based. Then there's the common people and the lowborn and everything else. So Korea's, if you go back to the three kingdoms, way back before, you know, from 600 to 900, you can find each one of these kingdoms had a very formalized, birth-based, hereditary aristocracy. And they've carried this kind of idea of hereditary power and social prestige all the way down into contemporary society. So when you look at that great tradition of Korea, men are writing in Chinese, are composing poems in Chinese forms, are doing landscape painting and all of the Chinese arts. There are many other ways that people express themselves artistically, but in terms of the formal male culture is very, very sinified. The other parts of Korea, and someone's interested in religion here, I know, are all of the other traditions that are indigenous to Korea: shamanism, Buddhism, which came in very early and which becomes as Korean as the day is long. I mean, it comes to Korea in the 4th century and is in Korea continuously since. Confucianism comes in early as well. So Korea's religious traditions, divide themselves up between a mixture of the indigenous and foreign-derived religions. Anyone want to make a speech right now? Or
Ask a question.
oh, there you go.
Speech.
No speech. This is, yeah, actually what I'm interested in is, because especially as Buddhism moves across Asia, it modifies
Yeah.
as it interacts with each differing indigenous kind of tradition. And one of the things I don't know much about actually in all this studies I've done in Buddhism is how does it end up looking at Korea? What makes it different from China or Japan or something?
Well, I mean, this is an area of weakness for me, other than, the Koreans, during various times, various sects of Buddhism become pronounced. What they call Chan Buddhism, or Son in Korean, the Zen traditions, as we understand the meditative, become very strong in Buddhists, in the Buddhist church. Exile during the Yi Dynasty, it becomes pushed to the periphery in the last 500 years. It was right at the center of governance and at the center of society during the previous dynasty, from 900 to 1392. There were more formal scriptural sects that dominated in Korea during the Koryo dynasty. There were even state officials, Buddhist, the highest, the Kuksa, the national monk, if you will, was part of the Koryo governance. And the Buddhist church had tremendous power and lands, and even informal armies themselves were, they had their own, they were a force. Korea was not as centralized in that previous period. When the Yi Dynasty comes into power, it basically is a reassertion or it's an assertion of Confucianism and Confucian orthodoxy as the law and thought of the land, which in effect marginalizes Buddhism. The lands are taken away, the monasteries are pushed out to the periphery, and there is a revival after in the 20th century during the Colonial period. The Buddhist church is alive and well in modern Korea. It's it's in evidence wherever you go. But the Koreans, much like I think the Chinese, are very eclectic in terms of the way in which they approach religion, whatever works. And in post-Chosun Korea, there is none of this business of looking at the non-dominant Confucianism as being heterodoxy. So people, except for Christians, which Christianity now is very important in Korea too. I should push into the modern era. We'll never get out of all this. Oh, yeah. Do you know how to torture a 19-year-old? You know, and exactly. Have them watch anyone over 60 manipulate a computer for 1 minute, and they're completely out of their mind. I still am just not quite used to these things. Now, how far did I get?
You went a little too far.
I went a little too far, yeah. All right. This is normally where I would start a course on modern Korea. You know, I would spend a little time, I mean, and I admit, I have followed student interests and have shaved down the discussion of the past and have simplified and simplified and simplified. And when I finally got a chance to write a little textbook on 20th century Korea, even the publisher had me boot out the first chapter. You know, said, nobody wants to read that stuff. You know, it's much, too much. You know, too much, too much. It's 100,000 words. Keep it to 100,000 words. The 19th century, you know, Korea's, you know, idol is broken, and it has found the capacity to adjust to all sorts of internal problems, peasant rebellions, famines, economic downturns, even recovered from the invasions, both the Manchus in the 17th century when the Ming Dynasty fell, and also the Hideyoshi invasions earlier. But when you combine its internal issues with external threat, this is when the system was really challenged and was unable really ultimately to survive. The guy that taught me in graduate school, Jim Palais, up at Washington, talks about the Chosun period as a system of marginal adjustment and equilibrium, so that it could do little changes very well. But if anything tipped it too long one way or the other, it would fall. So this balance between the king, the monarch, and his aristocrats was a kind of a checks and balances in many ways. And if the king could not get enough power to massively change the system without massive reaction from his Yangban aristocracy and his bureaucracy itself, nor could the aristocracy create a feudal system. They could not get rid of the monarch and then just devolve. So this system went on for all the way into the 19th century. But when it was asked to make structural changes, to create military power, to restructure its economy, to reorder the land system in order to raise taxes, to get the revenues, to do the things that was being required of it in the late 19th century, it just could not do it. One interest always checked the other interest. And so the record, when you start to read about Korea, is really a very depressing story because, and I remember reading these books that were written really quite a long time ago, and it was always like, where are the Koreans? It's all we're talking about is the Russians and the Japanese and the English and everybody else. And you know, the Koreans seem to be gone from the story after 1876. And well, that's because you know, the Koreans are just one of many actors that start to flow into Korea in the late 19th century. And you don't get this wonderful story of Meiji Japan, of this transformation from the top down, the Japanese making, you know, some overthrowing their system in 1868, and then very purposefully building a nation state. And we can project back on that story a lot more unity than there is. But in effect, we have the success story of the Japanese who arrive in Korea 30 years later as a modern imperial power, And the Koreans and the Chinese are just kind of hanging on and are not being decisive like us. So this idea that the Japanese transform, create an industrial capitalist economy, create the economic power from which they can build military power, and then start acting like Western imperialists, well, that's a story we understand. That's got a subject, and it's got success. But the Koreans trying to hang on to a system that they would have no reason to change, if you look objectively, this has been working for a long time for us. Our interests have been served, so maybe we can find a way to squeak through all this. Well, that's a very less satisfying story. And often the last important Korean king, Kojong, is really given a very bad rep as being weak and vacillating, and he was just buffeted by all these forces around him. Turns out he was a very bright guy, and he had a lot of ideas about modernizing Korea, none of which he could finance, none of which he could really get done. And so it is in this period that, in order to not really plague the students with this just depressing story of Korean failure, I switch the topics to nationalism, to the idea of intellectual transition, the ideas of what would happen to an agrarian economy when the modern world capitalist economy intrudes. All of these kind of larger forces that are impending on Korea really now come into relief in the late 19th century. And so it's an old system in the modern world, and it is the Korean leaders and intellectuals who are now trying to figure out, how do we transform who we are into this thing that is coming in. And they're looking at various places like England, the United States, the other European powers. Japan, they're looking very intensely at the Japanese model. Look what they have done that we're not doing. And there's a huge irony here, because ultimately it is the Japanese who take Korea over and reshape Korea in their image in the first half of the 20th century. And it is Korean intellectuals who in many ways are saying, come on in and do it. If we can't find a way to do it ourselves, you have the ideas, we're going to your schools, we're coming back to Korea, and yet older elites are saying, no, we can't change, because we know that if we move in that direction, we're out. And there will be a whole a revolution in who runs Korea if we drop the examination system, if we open up social mobility, if we change the economy. All of these things will basically undermine those forces that have upheld the social order for all of these years. And so ultimately, Korea does fall under Japanese dominion. And in many ways, the Japanese colonial period is the biggest problem for any historian when you want to talk about Korea, because modern Korean historical memory is totally skewed by the colonial experience. It's only 30 years. 500 years, 30 years. 5,000 years, 30 years. And if you reduced the colonial period to the war from 1937 to 45, those 8 years, the poisonous memory of those 8 years drives contemporary Korean historical narratives. I mean, it's way overweighted what happened in those last years of the colonial period and the war mobilization. And my whole career has been writing about the colonial period. What I find extraordinarily interesting is how well the Koreans have adapted to colonialism, and that how much happened in Korea in spite of the colonial system. And that, Koreans who are so bent on blaming the Japanese for everything that ever happened in Korea keep forgetting that the Koreans were the agents of their own modernity. It just happened to happen underneath the aegis of Japanese rule. The Japanese didn't build all those railroads, the Koreans did. Yes, the Japanese were systematically exploiting Korean resources. They were taking advantage of connecting Korea to the continent for their own strategic purposes. They were politically insensitive, culturally insensitive, you name it, all of those things. And yet Korea in 1945 was not Korea of 1876. In fact, it was way in advance of some places elsewhere in the world that had not had the experience of that kind of economic dynamism. Now, there's a big problem here when you look at change and you start attributing whose change was it. Back around 2000, I organized a conference with a friend of mine down at Stanford, and we were going to, we named the project Colonial Modernity in Korea. And we ultimately published a book and got into just so much trouble, I can't tell you how much trouble we got into. I mean, it was a very important book. But its premise, it was a contradiction to almost every Korean that looked at the title. Before we even had the conference, there were reporters from Korea asking us why we were justifying Japanese rule. We hadn't even had the conference. They wanted to come in and listen, and we didn't let them come in. Colonial modernity. Well, colonialism's an awful thing. Modernity is something different. It is about structures, it's about things that happen to society, change, everything else. And it has to do in history with, well, who does these things? Who's responsible? And to the Korean nationalist historians, we were saying that the Japanese modernized Korea. Well, that's not what we were saying at all. We were asking, what does modernity look like in a colonial guise? And indeed, Korea was a very interesting place after 1910. It had a very, this contemporary experience in the first part of the 20th century is really, really interesting. There's resistance, there's everyday, there's all of these things that you normally would think about talking about a colonial system. But if you say, what if we just looked at popular culture and what happened? What if we looked at the changes in the structures of work life? What if we looked at the rise of an industrial workforce and what that might mean in society? What about the shift from agricultural time to the clock? How do all the things we attribute to modernity in the modern world, that is in our Western history, how does that fit Korea's transition to its own unique form of being in the modern world? After all, the French might have invented the cinema, the machine that creates moving pictures, but is it French? No, it's a machine. And that machine ended up in Korea a month after it was, within 3 months, people were making movies in China and Korea after the thing had been invented. Well, does that mean that the cinema brought French influence into Korea? So, can we attribute these, can we ethnicize these machines? It is whoever's wielding the machine is doing the production, the cultural production. The machine, to me, is a neutral object. Now, the context in which it's being used can be 1900 France or 1900 Korea, and that's a different context. So you're looking at something that leaps out of the future back in time in a way, if we accept this idea of a kind of evolutionary time. And to see what Koreans were doing in the 1920s with all of these new things is really quite interesting. It's the same problem of talking about modern popular culture, modern Korean wave, that is the Hallyu. What is Korean about K-pop, other than there are Koreans doing it? If we look at the genre itself, the popular dance videos that are so popular in East Asia and even beyond today, the actual content, the dancing, the choreography, the music, is a melange of global popular culture, and there are Koreans putting it together. So what does it mean? Does this explain to me anything about Korea, or does it tell me more about the circulation of global popular culture? And I think these, as globalization and as these things start to circulate more intensively and more rapidly, it gets harder and harder to pull that ethnic label out, the new French wave. Now, I'm on real shaky ground here because we have people who really know about culture in the room, but, historically speaking, when people start to create labels about the Japanese this and Korean that, and Japanese repression and Korean resistance, it is again the problem of the historian of creating these gross subjects that are not basically real. When I talk about Korea does something, what is Korea? Well, it's 70 million people. Is that Korea? And is there any unity to that label? Well, the unity is in my mind and is in the minds of all of us who are reading about and creating these units. So just the wielding of the historical subject of nation, Korea, is something that obscures all of the diversity inside. And this is a large philosophical issue that I deal with in history classes. And any history you teach, any political science you teach, has to talk about that in order for us to talk about anything, we have to create these generalizations. Now, I'm going to move on very quickly, and then we'll go to more of a discussion. I can't probably get through all of this at all, but because it's 11:15, I can stop now and ask for questions, but I wanted to move on and talk about division and post-war for a little bit. But does anyone want to ask questions at this point? Take a break from my voice.
I was just going to ask, because I'm curious about your experience when you're talking to students and telling them you're creating generalizations, because I get a lot of pushback from students.
That's right.
They want the specifics about something, and it's, you can't, I mean, there's too many. You can't deal with every specific.
No, you can't. And that's why history is written like in narrative form, and it creates these individuated subjects. So that nationalism is taking the nation and creating an individual. And so it's a very interesting device, and we do it in all sorts of ways when we think, and we have to kind of pull it together. And I want students to try to think of it that way too, to remember that when you are making these kind of comments, you are obscuring always. And that, history is like writing novels, frankly. Although the facts are all out there and they're verifiable, the way it put them together is like any narrativist. And so we could all use the same facts and come up with very different novels. And if I can get them to know that, I can teach them how to read a newspaper. I can teach them how to basically evaluate the internet. That everything is not equal, and everything is put together in a certain way. And if you're skeptical, and if you're able to look at that, then I think you're going to be a better reader in the end. For political science and post-war history, Korea is an absolute gold mine for post-war global history. We can look at the division of Korea after 45 as, in a sense, the beginning of the Cold War division of the world. And we can see the continuing division of Korea as this Cold War moving into an anachronism, but remaining in place as really a feature of the post-Cold World order, of the New World Order, until that division is done, is finished, and moves on into some other form. We will continue to have World War II right in our face, right in Northeast Asia, and all of the great power relations are all frozen in time in many ways. The difficulty of US-Japanese relations has everything to do with the continuing division and Japan's problems because of the division. The lack of infrastructural development in Far East Siberia and the exploitation of some fabulous resources has a lot to do with the division of Korea. The intransigence of the Chinese in certain areas and our difficulties with China have to do with North Korea. So, I mean, you can just walk down the line and see how the artificial separation of the peninsula, which was caused by us and the Soviet Union and by other historical contingent factors, has continued to dominate the structures of political relations and economy of Northeast Asia right up to today. It's even spawned Cold War tourism. You can go up to the DMZ and go to a carnival and eat kimbap and have a picnic and stare into North Korea and watch a movie and go back through the tank traps and the minefields, and it's all part of the experience. It's still there, and it's being appropriated into modern global capitalism, seamlessly. Korea, the decision to go to war in Korea basically put in place American foreign policy for the next 40 years, containment. It was the gestation of the Vietnam War. If we were successful in Korea, why wouldn't we have been successful in Vietnam? It's given us a whole vocabulary of incomplete and limited warfare, wind chill, and surgical bombing, and all of the vocabulary of our current way in which we look at war. Much of it was developed in this first war of containment in the Cold War. And I don't talk much about the conduct of the war in Korea, but a lot about the policies that emanated out of the decisions to go to war and to involve the UN and all of those things. This is just a wonderful place to both teach about Korea, but also to show how our footprint and how our involvement in Korea becomes so intimate in the last, since 1945, when we began our portion of the occupation in the South. I also am able to distinguish between economic systems and the historical competition between global capitalism and a socialist alternative. Because when we look at nation building in North and South Korea in the 1950s, we're looking at two different economic social systems that are experiments, in effect. And we see one emerging in success later in South Korea, and the other one basically peaking and now declining in the North. but initially being much more successful in the South. And I know that Marx is no longer talked about much, and history is ended, and all of that. But it's my chance to teach them again about this vision that created the Soviet Union and other experiments in socialism in the 20th century that were so important. Yeah.
Well, in what ways was North Korea more successful than South Korea at the post?
Its rebuilding was much more, was much quicker. It had many advantages over the South and the immediate post-war, post-Korean War era. It had a relatively smaller but much more unified population. It had a very unitary single-party state that was very adept at mobilizing that population. They were able to use Soviet aid and Chinese labor aid to rebuild the economy rapidly. They also built on an industrial infrastructure that had been left after the Japanese. And by 1965, they had a GNP that was, a GNP equal to the South and a per capita income that would be higher,
Did you say 1965?
well, up into the mid-60s,
Mid-60s.
until the system ran out its productive capacity. And there for many, many reasons, not just because it was a command economy, but one of the things we can talk about are how a command economy works well initially. How did Stalin industrialize so rapidly? Because you're building from zero. And if you mobilize resources that intensively, you can build factories. The problem is the more complicated an economy gets, the harder it is to manage from the center. And we know that the market does better the more complex the economy is. South Korea had a larger population. It was more politically diverse. It had much more internal instability politically. It had less endowment for in industry, and so initially was disadvantaged. And so our defense of South Korea was necessary. The limits of the North Korean growth were reached in the early 70s. They started to flatten out, and then all of the problems of a planned economy started to plague them. The things that happen when you have dislocation and misallocation of resources, bad decisions about the way in which agriculture was being planned, put together with drought and floods and lack of access to foreign capital. And ultimately, they limp along until the fall of the socialist world economy, then they're in real trouble. Because they were artificially sustained by their connections to the Soviet Union and Eastern Europe all the way up until the 80s. They have no sources of export foreign exchange earnings, so they can't borrow money for infrastructural and for tech transfer and for all the capital inputs that you need to keep growing. South Korea made the decision, ultimately to borrow, which was, in terms of North-South conflict, perfect for North Korean propaganda. Look at the South. They're puppets of the world economy. They're puppets of the American. These child-eating capitalists are borrowing money and selling their birthright and blah, 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 blah. Well, yeah, that's exactly what they did, and they paid the loans back. North Korea develops this insular idea of self-reliance, and they project it to their economic policies, meaning you can't play ball in a larger economy. It's a very limiting kind of idea. So the North and South economic and developmental paths are very illustrative of the late 20th century. I'm just going to touch on contemporary Korea and post-industrial societies. I've had the privilege of watching Korea go from a third world country, South Korea. When I go there, I'm in the Peace Corps, and the Peace Corps is in South Korea. I mean, if you go to Korea today, I mean, you can't imagine the Peace Corps for Africa,
Yeah.
you know, or Latin America or something, you know, and
My niece is right now.
just watching the arc of development in Korea has just been an amazingly fascinating experience for me. And at some points, they get to very interesting debates inside of South Korea about consumption. See, if we are to save and work hard to build the nation and protect ourselves from communism, when do we stop saving and stop building and stop working hard, and when can we spend our money? Well, right about the 90s, they start to ask the question, because they are being told by the world, we're not going to give you any more breaks. You guys have to play ball, no more tariffs for you, no more dumping on our economy. You guys have to start accepting our cigarettes and our beef and all of these other things. As they got richer and richer, suddenly they're being treated like another middle-class economy. But the Koreans themselves were worried that if they started spending, then the whole thing would crash. And so there's these wonderful debates about overconsumption. And, you know, what does it mean to be an affluent society? Well, this is my opportunity to do American history. Because, you know, we haven't always just been spendthrifts and total, you know, consumers. In the 1920s, advertising was in its infancy, and advertising was born to convince people to not be so Lutheran about your money. You know, it's okay to spend. You know, just because you grew up on a farm and you made everything and you canned your vegetables and you produced all of your entertainment and you did everything else, it's okay to spend. You know, and this is something that's happened throughout the world. And as people develop disposable income, and it's, I think, another larger idea to interest the students in this idea about it's just not so natural for us to think about a service economy, that we live in a service economy, that, you know, we came from farms, we came from places where we produced everything ourselves. And if you go further back, you know, we made our own cloth. So here the Koreans are in the 1990s talking about kwasobi. Too much consumption is going to lead to, I don't know what, but it's bad.
What was the term that you used?
Kwasobi.
Kwasobi.
K-W-A-S-O-B-I. Sobi is to consume. Kwa is excessive. So this is the YMCA, by the way, and other conservative editorialists saying, back in the 1960s, we were all in the same boat, we were together, everybody saved, we worked hard, and look at these young people. Just going out and drinking and eating and buying things, and my God, it's all going to hell in a handbasket. Now, does that sound familiar? Yes, it does. And it's not because it's a Judeo-Christian problem, it's a Confucian problem. Work hard, your success will come later. Deferred gratification actually comes right out of the cultural stuff that many Koreans grew up with. Go to school, work hard, study. Your time now is to study. We're not looking for you to go out to the clubs, you know. And so when Koreans my age, or in their 50s and above, I think, and probably you too, look at these young kids today, and they're all in the subway mirror going like this with product in their hair, and the little guys are worrying about how their collars are fitting, and these older Korean men are looking at this and they're thinking, oh, what did we do? We got rich, and this is what happened. You know, so that contemporary Korean dialogue that's going on in South Korea is something very new for them, but it also recapitulates some of the struggles over the 1950s and the cultural wars of the 60s and early 70s in the United States. And this idea when a society does come to grips with changing mores and changing attitudes towards affluence and consumption. And so Korea has come a very, very long way in the 20th century, from when I was a child looking at ads on the television that would talk about Korean orphans and give to care and to give to the NGOs that were helping in the aftermath of the Korean War. Korea, to me, was just the quintessence of a horrible, failed place. And in many ways, that image survived in the United States into the 1980s. And it's only now that people are now getting to recognize that this place is no longer the Korean War anymore. They're not dumping night soil all over the place. It doesn't smell like shit. You know, it's got modern, in fact, it makes Indiana look like the third world. Is what it's making, what's happening. I take my students to Korea from Indiana, and they're all full of themselves. And I tell them, start walking up the stairs, get new clothes, we're going to Korea. And the first day they're there, they're profoundly embarrassed. They don't look very good. They can walk for one day and then they're exhausted. They don't know what a subway, they don't know how to ride the subway, they don't know, and it takes them one day to adapt, only one day. I'm proud of my students. The girls are in the store the next day. The guys are getting their act together, and once they've learned the trains, they're gone. You know, and I take them to Samsung, and Samsung shows them all sorts of gizmos that aren't sold in the United States. Well, why can't we have that? Well, you don't know what to do with that. And you don't have a system that will work. That is, your cell system will not handle this machine. And that was probably the biggest lesson they got in 10 days. You know, you know, and so again, at the end of the class, I can attack American exceptionalism and, you know, talk about, well, what has happened since '75 and how has the world changed. It's not so much that America is falling as that all around us, these other societies are rising in levels of economic and technical sophistication, and don't get so set in your attitudes about everything stays the same everywhere. You know, people are all developing together, and that's partly why I find Korea to be such a compelling case study for all of these different ideas. And so I'll stop there and let you guys talk if we have any time. We have that's right, there are no leaders today. See, there's no leaders. So, the hell with you guys, we'll just talk. Any other observations or questions?
So, when you're looking at text, how does it get played out, this concept of ritual language versus a sense of secret superiority? How will those things manifest itself in the historical text that you're reading?
In the historical texts, well, in the narratives I'm using, there's a language of this world, and it's a language that survives even into the present day. And one of the words is sade, S-A-D-A-E, two Chinese characters that basically mean to serve the great. So that the relationship between China and Korea was described by the Koreans as sade. So we are serving the great. That word took on a bad connotation after sort of the nationalist movement emerges in the late 19th century. The idea of a consciousness of sade wishik, or to be a person of sade, a sade juja, means you're a kind of a lackey, or you're just somebody's lackey. Whereas before it was perfectly okay, neutral, diplomatic language to describe a real relationship that had certain meanings. Interestingly, the core idea of North Korean ideology is a word called juche, which means self-mastery, or independence or autonomy. So the opposite of Sade, in many ways, is Juche. And in the turn of the century, in the discourse in the newspapers, this whole idea of Sade Juche emerges as part of the discussion of who are we as Koreans to be serving anybody, any master.
When did this emerge?
Well, the words are very old.
Yeah, yeah.
They're Chinese
I get it.
derived.
But when did the discussion?
This in the 1890s.
Oh, in the,
Yeah.
yeah.
And so people like, you know, and I can put this with the writings of certain people. Shin Che-ho, who's an early historian, talked about Juche and talked about Sade. And North Korean propaganda is filled with this, that the South Koreans are still serving the master. They're still serving the master of the outside world. That why are the Americans still have troops in South Korea? This is an outrage. Now the troops are down to nothing practically, and they're off the front line, but there's still a large military establishment in South Korea. So in propaganda terms, South Koreans can be embarrassed if they take a pure nationalist line like the North would be taking. But they could also point out that, yeah,
They get to eat.
no, we're not serving anybody, but we are enmeshed in a community of the globe. And unlike you, who are totally isolated and sitting in a cave, we are part of the world, you know, and this is the way the world works. So this idea, and you can be Juche all you want, and look what it's gotten you.
Yeah.
I think the South Koreans are winning that war.
Well, I think they are. I mean, they're winners in terms of, in a number of ways. And so the idea that North Korea is still there is really perplexing. It's kind of like the 2-year-old, you know, well, or somebody with holding a gun against their head and saying, you know, if you get anywhere near me, I'll kill myself. Go ahead. But nobody wants North Korea to kill themselves. So the paradox is that all around North Korea, all the great powers, nobody wants North Korea to be gone, because then we'd have to rethink everything, wouldn't we? The Chinese need North Korea, and the Russians need North Korea. We need North Korea in certain ways. You know,
Could you tell us what ways
Yeah,
the
are you
different
gonna talk about
countries
that?
need?
well, China wants a buffer. They don't want you know, a South Korea right on the Yalu River. In a way, we want North Korea because we don't want the Chinese to be taking North Korea over or anything else. So we don't want North Korea, but we certainly want North Korea to be not North Korea on our terms, and we can't find any. The Japanese are worried because if Korea reunified, then Korea is like a lot bigger and a lot more vibrant and a lot more nasty, and they still don't like us. You know, so I mean, you just go around, all the way around the tube, and nobody can quite envision what a not North Korea would look like. And, you know, global sort of diplomatic politics is profoundly conservative. So in the absence of, we'll take what we know in the absence of an unstable and unknowable future. If North Korea and South Korea, well, the bomb is another problem. What do we do about the atom bomb? And now that they've got the atom bomb, what do we, you know, what can be done? Well, they're a threat to the global non-proliferation treaty. But they're more stable than Iraq. So there's always some place that's much more of a problem currently. So why don't we just let this ossified problem fester, and we'll worry about ISIS and all of the, you know, the instability in the Middle East. And in many ways, that's masked the problem in North Korea. We were doing great up till about 2000. We actually had a modus vivendi with the North. The Clinton regime, the Clinton administration had sort of denuclearized North Korea, very similar to what we were trying to do with Iran. And it had sort of been working. And then Bush was elected, the second Bush. And he decided to put North Korea in the axis of evil, yes. And the North Koreans went nuts. They just went berserk. They felt threatened. They reneged. They went off in another direction. I don't know that that's a direct line causation.
It's one reading.
It's one way to look at it, but
Yeah.
I think they had basically, the weaker you are, the cheaper it is to make a bomb and protect yourself that way than to create an economy. Once everything else is gone, just harbor your resources. And it's one of the ways to keep people from bothering you.
Well, it becomes sort of
Well-
a unifying mantra too. You know, if you want to get your whole people together, it's kind of like.
Absolutely. I mean,
kinda
we
like
we are real. We are one of the nuclear club, and their population is very proud of that. The North Koreans have this sense that they are a major power. And it's a very important part of how they relate with their population. The idea that they're encircled, that they're threatened from all over, that they all have to remain tough to protect the socialist paradise. And people actually will work for this. You don't know anything else. So, what a terrible way to end. But we have others with other things to do. So thank you for your attention, and you'll have time all during the day to talk about these things, come back and forth. So thank you very much.
Thank you.